Hey there, Dunker Punks. Matt Riddle here, he, him pronouns, pastor of the Arlington Church of the Brethren, and host for this ongoing series that's a partnership with Women's Caucus to further illuminate the passions and backgrounds of our annual conference ballot nominees. Whether you're learning for your own information as a delegate, to talk to other people about in community, or just to know how to counsel your church's delegate, it is so important to take it all in and then communicate it to the leaders you know to make sure that your voice is heard. Young people have interest, insight, care, and hopeful energy that our denomination needs today if we are to ever thrive tomorrow. So, with the annual conference coming up, make sure to pass on what you're listening to. Take it all in and then pass it on. Pass it on and talk to your pastor or your church's delegate or any engaged leader you know. Make sure that your voice and energy are heard so we can build together a vision for tomorrow that represents your passions and insights best. So let's take another dive into the pool of nominees and continue our journey. In this episode, Bobby Dykema interviews the candidates for Annual Conference Secretary David Shumate and Connie Burkholder.
What makes the position you're being considered for important in the life of the broader church, whether Church of the Brethren or the Christian church as a whole?
Well, I believe that the annual conference secretary is a person that assists the annual conference officers by taking the minutes, by keeping an accurate record of what takes place, by having a knowledge of the polity and the policy and the practice and the procedure of the church. And that particular role has a presence that provides continuity for the leadership team of the Church of the Brethren. Now, as far as how that applies to the wider church, it would be harder for me to say that.
So how would you say that you are better suited for this position this year than you might have been 5 or 10 or even 20 years ago?
Well, I have about 30 years experience taking minutes because I serve, my paid position is I'm the district executive minister. My organizational position is I'm the secretary of the corporate board. And so I take all of the minutes for the executive committee, all of the minutes for the district board. I prepare the agendas and the attachments. I send those out. And we have a board that is approximately the same size as the standing committee of the Church of the Brethren. So I'm used to dealing with that kind of material. The custodian of the official records of the corporation. Every year, we have a notebook that we keep each district board year in, and those tend to be 4 to 6 inches because we have 4 quarterly meetings of the executive committee, 4 quarterly meetings of the board, and that does not count call meetings. So I've been used to coordinating all that with the help of the staff that I have.
Terrific. Thank you. So is there a person or an organization, either currently or in your past, that has inspired you or helped you develop your gifts for the passion and skills for this position?
Well, I've worked with Fred Swartz when I was the annual conference moderator, and Fred was a great man to work with. I've worked with Jim Beckwith because he was the moderator before I was. And I have been a prayer partner with Jim, as well as the other district executives and the leadership team for many years, which Jim has had a real ministry to me in reminding me that he is praying for me as a district executive. And I certainly have prayed for the leadership team all that time, and he and I communicate about that more than I would with the others. So in that sense, I've Kathy Huffman was secretary of annual conference, and she and I have been friends for a long time. She was district conference moderator. She's served in numerous district roles. And so those are people that I've worked with on that level. I suppose the inspiration for me being in the position that I'm in, probably there are two people that really were important to me in considering a district executive position, which comes with all the experiences that I've had. And that would have been Owen Stoltz, who was my district executive when I was a young person. And he had a very good pastoral style. And then the former district executive in Illinois, Wisconsin, which was Carl Myers, who, when I was testing out my call, took me sight unseen and placed me in a church in central Illinois, and was very good to follow up with me. I remember one time I ran into him at Bethany Chapel, and he asked me how the people in the church were, and I said, well, I think they're comfortable. And he said, that's what I was afraid of. And so he was teaching me lessons, and I was soaking that up. And I would also say that my experiences in the church over the years, many of which have not been sweetness and light, have inspired me to do this kind of work. I mean, I'm used to the joys and the meaning of it all, and I'm also used to the difficulties and the hardships that come with this kind of work.
That's great. Thank you. So I know that when folks are nominated for the annual conference ballot, you get an email indicating the brief reason for nomination. But in your own words, why do you think you were nominated for this position?
I suspect it was someone that's worked with me on the district board or in some way, shape, or form that's familiar with me. It may have been not only because they've seen me do secretarial kinds of work, but it may be also because, we have to hash through a lot of polity and other kinds of issues that make me familiar with the structure of the church. And I've been teaching a polity leadership class for quite some time for non-seminary ministers. So could have been one of those folks. And the fact is, I actually withdrew my name from nomination, and I got a call from the nominating committee and was asked to put it back in. So, because I had decided that I needed to take my hand off the doorknob and let God open the doors. Mm. And so I figured when I got the call from him to put it back in, that might have been God, but we'll leave that to subjective imagination.
Wonderful. Thank you. So holding a leadership position in the church is a lot of work on top of whatever else you've got going on in your life. So how do you envision taking care of yourself while juggling multiple responsibilities should you be elected?
Well, recently you probably read that I've announced my retirement at the end of this year. And part of the reason for announcing that early was to facilitate the district board in being able to replace me so that there might be some overlap time at the end of the year where I would fade out and the other person would, for lack of a better phrase, fade in. One of the reasons that I retired is that I've had a couple of experiences in the last 6 years that really led me to that decision. The first was I had a life-threatening illness in 2016 that resulted in me being in the hospital and therapy for 56 days. And I came out of that with the idea that I really needed to do better health-wise in in taking care of myself. And I probably would have retired from this position in 2018, 2019, but I stayed because of the difficulties that the district and the church at large are going through, because I felt like I had something to add to that, which is, I would call that relational glue. I don't know a better way to put it. And when the pandemic came, I went from working 70 and 80 hours a week and traveling 35,000 miles a year to all of a sudden less than 10,000 and working 40 or 45 hours a week. And as a result, I had more time for exercise, and I have walked for many, many years. And so I went from walking 400 miles a year to last year I walked 2,400. And so as a result, I lost approximately 130 pounds without being on any program. And I guess the other side of that is that when you work with the church, and I'm sure you've experienced this, almost everything we do has a meal event attached to it. And if you're district executive, if I'm having a 3 or a 4 church Sunday, I might have 3 or 4 meals during the course of that day. And even though you might try to eat less, you know, the boundaries get blurred. And then to leverage my time, I often had meals with pastors during the week. And as a result, when the pandemic came, I didn't, the church meals went away. And it was a lot easier to guard my boundaries. So the positive was the exercise. The negative was refraining from temptation. So as things have opened back up a little bit, it became apparent to me that it was going to be harder for me to find the time to do the things that I wanted to do. And my doctor says I'm the 4 healthiest people he knows. Not one of the 4, but all 4. And so I feel like that by retiring, I can maintain a level of exercise and a level of non-consumption that would benefit me because I'm maintaining healthy boundaries. Hopefully that makes sense to you.
Absolutely. That's really great for you. So one last 2-part question, which is probably the deepest question. What is your vision for the Church of the Brethren, and how do you long for us to become more aligned with the teachings of Jesus?
Well, I hesitate to talk about vision for the Church of the Brethren because my understanding of our theology is that we work at those kinds of things collectively. I would like to see us be a church that is more including, more involving, more outgoing than what we've been. And one of the things that has meant a lot to me in the work that I've been at here is we have multiple cultures anyway, because we cover an area that's 500 miles wide and about 200 miles deep at its largest. And when I started, there were probably about 8 different cultures that I identified amongst the 90-some odd churches that I was working with. But since that time, we have planted 3 churches that are primarily Latino. And I've really been stretched by the fact that I don't think I realized how ordered brethren are until I saw how the Latino church works at things. And it's radically different. And that was helpful for me. And I would like to see us really reach out to people that are different than we are, not to be trophies, but to learn from them and to welcome them. And, that's a journey I've been on for a long time, and I'm still on that journey.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Now, do you want to talk a little bit about Jesus and his teachings?
Yeah.
I always have enjoyed the words of comfort of Jesus, but I have always been challenged by the hard sayings. And I think sometimes we have majored on applying the teachings of Jesus to society, which is important, without talking about how they apply to each of us as individuals and how we have to work at those things. And so, I have over the years picked certain verses and thought, now, how does that work in my life? When Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, what kind of peacemaker am I? When Jesus said, you have heard it said, love your friend, hate your enemy, so to speak. But I say to you, which there's no direct Old Testament or Hebrew Bible citation for that, but Jesus said it anyway. So it must have been a popular saying. The Sermon on the Mount really should challenge all of us. It certainly challenges me. And I think about, people like Simon Peter that on the one hand confessed Jesus as the Messiah and the Christ, and turns right around and Jesus ends up saying to him, Satan, get thee behind me. So, we're all works in progress with Jesus. And I don't believe that I'm a finished work, and I don't know anybody that is. But we need to struggle with those things and trust the grace and mercy of the Almighty as we journey through that. I've sometimes wondered if one of the things that hinders us as a church, and it's difficult for me to say this as a bureaucrat, because I also understand the reasons for this, but it's difficult. I wonder if church membership keeps us from inviting people to seek Jesus or to follow Jesus. And I'm not sure that those are the same thing. I'm pretty sure they're not. And I would like to see us have that kind of discussion in the church. We've spent way too much energy over the years fighting battles, and we have spent not enough time following Jesus. So that's my benediction.
Amen. Thank you, brother. Well, I will be holding you in prayer as we approach the annual conference, and whichever way the election goes, I'm glad to know that you're on the ballot. In your view, what makes the position that you're being considered for annual conference secretary important in the life of the broader church?
Well, when I knew that I was when I was on the initial ballot that the standing committee was going to vote on, I announced to my congregation about that, and I said, sort of in jest, that it was more like a secretary to the brethren world rather than a secretary for the annual conference. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, I suppose, but the role is defined as a secretary or minute taker for a number of denominational groups. So it carries with it a significance just because of having a great deal of responsibility for the record keeping of those groups of leaders. The annual conference secretary also, as I've heard it described, it participates fully in the leadership team of the denomination, and so is officially one of the officers of our beloved church. So there's a potential for helping to guide the ministry and the direction of the denomination. And the secretary is also, as I understand it, a point of contact in various ways on behalf of the leadership team with members of the denomination. And I see that as a significant role as well, as the leadership team seeks to communicate carefully and accurately and wisely to the wider church. So those are some of the reasons I see the role being important in the life of the Church of the Brethren.
What is your vision for the Church of the Brethren, and how do you long for us to become more aligned with the teachings of Jesus?
Well, I'm very thankful for the compelling vision statement, and certainly give my support as we seek to make that vision become reality. I think it's connected for a number of people as kind of building on our, identification line, continuing the work of Jesus peacefully, simply together. It puts some other language in front of us to, I think, work at continuing in that manner. So that I can embrace that vision for the denomination. Beyond that, I wanted to answer your question by way of telling about a couple retreat experiences I've had in the last few months. I did leadership in 2 different retreat settings earlier this year. In that first retreat, in the Calling the Called retreat, I was caught up short at one point. I had shared that we work at spiritual discernment by paying attention to the movement of the Holy Spirit within us in our spiritual consolations and desolations. And then that when we've done that, we also have another step in terms of testing a decision against the witness of Scripture and the teachings of the church. And in the midst of that, I realized that all the persons that were on this Zoom retreat that were discerning, or who I knew that were discerning, they were all women. Mm-hmm. And I found myself saying, sometimes the teachings of the church have to catch up with the way that the Spirit is moving in people, or some kind of language like that. I felt like I had to acknowledge that the church does not always welcome women into ministry or leadership roles. And then in that second retreat, again, there were women there discerning their call, and some of them were women of color. And I don't really know about their experiences. Most of them, I was just meeting them for the first time I felt that I had to acknowledge that sometimes there's a lag between how persons are being called to serve and what gets proclaimed as the teachings of the church. As it's only been in my lifetime, specifically in 1958, that women were granted full ordination rights. So from the 1834 annual meeting, where Sarah Ryder Major was called on the carpet and she was told, no, women are not permitted to preach, until 1958, 124 years passed. And of course, Sarah Major continued to preach courageously, even though she still met with resistance and prejudice. So, today we still have some of that issue in our midst, and we have other additional issues of welcome and inclusion that are divisive for us. And so your question prompted me to think about that in terms of my own hope and longing for the church is that the teachings and statements of the church would more be in line with the teachings of Jesus, who welcomed all and called all people to serve. And so I hope that it doesn't take 124 more years for us to get to that point. So, I know that there are other things that I hope and long for in the church, but this is one of them that has been important for me to work at around the edges, perhaps not announcing it on the rooftops, but encouraging women in ministry, encouraging my sisters and brothers in the LGBTQ community to be part of the church and to be here, and for us to be able to say that all are welcome.
Thinking about yourself, what makes you better suited for this position now that you might have been 5 or 10 or even 20 years ago?
Mm-hmm. Well, frankly, I would not have considered a nomination to this position prior to being a district executive. I don't know that anybody thought about that for me, but I don't think I would have. Serving in the district executive role gave me experience with the wider church and expanded my knowledge and awareness of groups and people and processes. Not that I know everything or everyone in the denomination or know everything about the denomination, not by a long shot, but that ministry as in the district ministry gave me a point of entry that I hadn't had before. Mm-hmm. And I think that experience makes me better suited than I was prior to that. And that's been some time ago. I started as district executive in Northern Plains in 1996. So, that's been a significant while ago. But also in the last several years, I feel like I've come to claim my authority as a minister in deeper ways. Now, I realize that you don't have to be ordained or licensed to the ministry to be in the secretary role. But I have I think a deeper sense of that authority. And it happened particularly when I was pastoring in Roanoke, Virginia. I began to recognize that my years in ministry had come to help me be more mature in my wisdom, and that, after 30 some years at that point, that I probably had something to offer to the church, more than I had perhaps realized. And that was particularly true in relationship to an opportunity I had to supervise someone who was a seminary student and in training for ministry. And I developed a greater sense of how I was giving leadership in that congregational setting as well, calling the congregation to step out in leadership with courage and faith and integrity into, at some point, some new ministry, and to move sort of off dead center where they had been for a while because of some, difficult circumstances. So through all of that, I think I've come to a deeper sense of just who I am in ministry and in leadership within the church, just, in those last several years.
Oh, thank you. It's wonderful to hear more about your journey and get to know you better in this process as well. So.
Yeah. Well, it's been interesting to think back over it too for this purpose. Yeah.
Cool. So is there a person or an organization, either now or in your past, that has inspired you or helped you develop your gifts towards the passion and skills in preparation for this position?
Well, there have certainly been people along the way in my life who've called me to leadership and encouraged me, and persons who have modeled leadership in the church who have helped shape me, and modeled women in leadership in the church. And that's been true for me from my years as a young adult. That's when I would, I guess, began to notice that people were shaping me for leadership and for ministry. And so that's continued over my life. Now, I can't think of anyone who specifically shaped me for the annual conference secretary role. That's a pretty specific kind of task, I guess. But as I mentioned earlier, being a district executive and serving as part of the Council of District Executives gave me a glimpse into the working of the denomination, and being part of the Council of District Executives and being the secretary of that group for a term gave me some practical experience in the secretarial role.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So I know that when persons are nominated, you get an email saying this is the person who nominated you, and here's their rationale. But how would you, in your own words, describe why you think you were nominated for this position?
Well, there were actually, the nomination came from two sources. I mean, there were two different nominations. One was from a district executive who I had actually not met prior to being the interim in Illinois, Wisconsin. I mean, I knew of him and had respect for what I've seen of him, but had not really worked with him or met him. So he sent me a note about his nomination, saying that he was aware of my skills for taking minutes in meetings. So I assume he had been reading back through the code minutes or something, I don't know, and had a sense of that. So, and I guess just to say that someone who knew me in that interim role in Illinois, Wisconsin had that sense of perhaps I could serve in this role. So I don't know more than that from that nomination. The other source was actually from the Verlina District Board. And of course, there are folks who know me there because of my having served for 3 years in that district, and then from seminary and other contexts. But what they expressed was that they knew of my experience in leadership in the denomination as a district executive, and that I would bring a calm presence to the annual conference secretary work. So that's what I gleaned from those context. I think my experience has been that most people have a sense of my being trustworthy in the ways that I've been in leadership. And so I suppose that's part of it, although that was not expressed specifically.
Well, I bless those folks for bringing your name forward.
Oh, well, the district executive titled his email to me, "Sorry, not sorry." So which seemed pretty apt to me in light of this being such a weighty role. But so I decided I would accept the nomination, even despite that weightiness at this point.
Well, that just folds right into the next question. Holding a leadership position in the church is a lot of work on top of whatever other roles or tasks or family and personal life you have. So how do you envision taking care of yourself while juggling responsibilities of annual conference secretary should you be elected?
Yeah, that is a good question, because it is a very weighty position. The more I read about it, the more I thought, this is ridiculous. I mean, it is actually I think the officers are intending to look at the scope of that, because it is quite a lot of responsibility for a volunteer position. Well, anyways, at this time, though, in my life, I'm in my retirement years, though I am part of a pastoral team where I preach about once a month, and I also have other responsibilities within the congregation that, I carry out in various ways. If I'm elected to the annual conference secretary role, it's possible that I may need to limit some of those responsibilities. And I've given that a little bit of thought. I didn't feel like I wanted to go too far down that road without really seeing how that role would develop if I would be elected. In terms of other ways, I'm thinking about self-care. I'll certainly be continuing my spiritual practices, my practice of daily centering prayer and reading of devotional materials, and of course, I'll continue to meet with my own spiritual director on a monthly basis. And in the past, for quite a number of years in my ministry, I've tried to take periodic retreat days away from ministry. And the last few years, I've not found an easy way to do that. And in the pandemic, it's been practically impossible, because the places that one would go for a spiritual retreat have been closed, or very limited visitors or guests. So I'm hoping to, whatever happens with the balloting, the election, I'm hoping to do that for myself, as I find that a way to keep grounded deeply in God's care for me, and just a refreshing way of for my spirit. In terms of some other self-care, during the pandemic, again, it's just affected so much. I got disconnected with the fitness center where I have a membership, where I was going fairly regularly at some points over the last several years. But I'm just getting restarted there now that the rates of cases in the area and the transmission rate is low. So that would be part of my self-care for staying healthy. And then, your question was helpful, because it got me to thinking, okay, what else would I need in this role, because of the connections and responsibilities? And so I'm wondering for myself if I would need to reach out to some other persons for support in these circumstances. And I don't know what that would look like yet, but I do want to consider that, if that seems like that would be helpful as I'm in the midst of it. And then another piece that's been important for me is I have a friend from seminary who, across the years, we've been talking on a monthly basis on the phone, and during the pandemic, we've increased that to every other week. And those kinds of connections from a distance, from someone who knows me well from across the years, is an important part of my self-care, and kind of staying grounded and attuned to where I am and what I'm doing. So those are some ways that I've thought of from your question.
Terrific.